On this week's episode of Non-Native Creative, I'm very pleased to welcome Momoko Nakamura to the show. Momoko is the author of Plant-Based Tokyo, a new guide and resource that features restaurants in the Tokyo and Tokyo areas with plant-focused menus. Her work encompasses a wide range of things, but with a central focus on food, and she aims to better connect people with the Japanese countryside. You can also find, from among her services, a special rice subscription service. It's based on Japan's MicroSeasons, and she chooses blends from among 400 different varieties available in Japan. This was a super interesting talk with a lot of depth, especially relating to communication. I hope that you enjoy all the things that we talked about and check her out on social media after you listen to this discussion. Enjoy! On this week's episode of Non-Native Creative, I am very excited to welcome Momoko Nakamura, author of Plant-Based Tokyo and extraordinary food and Japan, sustainability-related food consulting amazing person. I'm so excited to speak to you and to have you on the show today. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have you. If you are not familiar with her work, she is also called Rice Girl online and has so many cool projects that I hope we can talk all about in our time together. So I want to begin our interview today by asking you the same question that I ask everybody. I'm borrowing from the X-Men series with this question, but I ask everybody to share their origin story. So what was the thing that happened, or what was kind of the experience that you had that got you started on the road that led you to where you are today? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes. My origin story with Rice Girl is actually my origin story as me person, Momoko.
Okay.
So they definitely can't be separated. I mostly grew up in the U.S. and I lived in the U.S. and U.K. and kind of went back and forth between there and Japan. And so much of my life I've spent outside of Japan. Mm-hmm. And my single connection, consistent connection with Japan was the dinner table, what we ate. Mm-hmm. And as the fundamental staple of Japanese cuisine, we ate rice every single day, or I, because I lived alone for many years too. So, even when I was living in an apartment by myself, it was kind of the bowl of rice that was always kind of that consistent staple for me.
Okay.
And after college, I became a television producer for food shows in the U.S. and the U.K. And I was always in a position to communicate food. Mm-hmm. Through the lens of television, through the TV screen. Mm-hmm. And it was hugely interesting to do that at the time that I did, because in the US and the UK, actually very few people were cooking at home. It wasn't cool like it is now. It wasn't this kind of romanticized thing. Mm-hmm. It was, just on the end of people, of the era of people relying on frozen dishes and, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And
yes.
In the U.S., most people will know Food Network, but Food Network had not come to be yet, and, that sort of thing. And so... Mm-hmm. It was a very interesting time because it was a time of change. People started looking at cooking and food in a different way. Mm-hmm. They started realizing that chefs are indeed celebrities.
Oh, okay.
And they do fascinating things with food.
I see.
And this is what you can do in your home kitchen. And perhaps even more luxurious than eating out is eating at home. Mm-hmm. And, all of these things. And so I was really happy to be working in food entertainment because it actually did create a shift in people's minds about food and cookery in general.
See. Are there any shows that you can share that maybe people watching or listening would be familiar with?
Yes, well, mostly I focused on Iron Chef America, which is Ryori no Tetsujin in Japan, mm-hmm. and it was made into an American show. And I was on that starting team because we needed to figure out how to edit the format so that it would meet the needs of an American audience. Mm-hmm. And then I worked on other shows like MasterChef, mm-hmm. for example. So it was all of the shows that I worked on are food chef related programming. Yeah.
Okay, so you had this it seems like it was a very, very natural progression for you of this relationship with food in the home and then into your job as well. And so you were working in food-related media production in the UK and throughout Europe for a number of years. And then eventually you decided to relocate to Tokyo, where we are today.
Right.
So what kind of made that shift occur for you?
Well, I always knew that I would end up in Japan because it's the place where I felt the most at home. I feel like I am a citizen of the world, but I realized in traveling that immigration doesn't think so. So you have to choose. And of all the places that I've been, I feel like Japan fits me, my person. That's not to say that my siblings who have had the exact same upbringing as me, my sister, for example, she loves living in New York still. So, I think it just depends on you and your work and that sort of thing. But so when I came to Japan, I thought, well, I've been working through the television screen. I'd prefer now, if I can, to work closer human to human.
I see.
And what does that mean? And so I went back into my childhood memories and realized how important rice was to me and all of the stories that I can tell through rice. I also realized that Japanese people are incredibly discerning about food, so food and drink. So, for example, branded beef or the type of wine or the coffee beans they get. But for some reason, this staple of the dinner table, people are not that knowledgeable. Everyone loves rice. It's an incredibly important part of the food culture, but people are not necessarily that discerning.
That's true. I feel like there's a very strong sense of brand loyalty. If you ask people, they probably have a favorite rice, I feel like, koshikari or something like that. But beyond maybe a certain brand that they're familiar with, at least I haven't heard many conversations relating to more, specific topics.
Right, absolutely. And, there are actually said to be 400 varietals of rice in Japan, grown in Japan. And with climate change and global warming, rice can be grown very easily in places like Hokkaido, which used to have too many months of snow that it wouldn't be appropriate to grow rice there. But now you can, and there's loads of delicious rice being grown in Hokkaido too. So from all the way in snowy Hokkaido down to tropical Okinawa, really every nook and cranny of Japan, there's rice grown.
Wow, I had no idea. Yeah. That's very interesting though, that the Hokkaido rice only became possible because of climate change related issues. That's very interesting. That's very interesting.
Yes, because they say, well, it takes about 10 months to grow rice. And so it's kind of like birthing a child. You need that whole year. So if most of the months are snowy, then it's not possible. So now it is made possible for many reasons. Yeah.
So you took this interest and this very, I don't want to say basic, but this very fundamental food in Japan, and you've kind of built this amazing, I guess, series of projects around this interest. So you have maybe the first thing that we could talk about then is kind of one of the first things that I had the chance to experience from you, which was correct me if I'm using the wrong terminology here, but micro-seasonally divided or micro-seasonally determined rice packages, blends that you provide to people worldwide now to share this incredible depth and breadth of flavor and also cultural background. So you provide a service now that does that for people all across the world.
Yes.
Was that an accurate? I don't know if that was an accurate description
or
absolutely,
wonderfully accurate. So I provide micro-seasonally selected rice varietals and blend them according to the micro-season. So in Japan, there's the 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter, that break down into 24 subseasons. And those 24 subseasons break down further into 72 micro-seasons. Now, following and keeping up with the 72 micro-seasons is a little bit of a too much running around because that means the seasons change every 5 days.
Oh, wow.
So I focus on the 24 sub-seasons. So that's about 14 to 15 days of duration. And basically following this microseasonal calendar, this traditional microseasonal calendar of Japan, helps us appreciate the now. It's for example, I'm not so good with incredibly hot and humid weather. But when you're following the microseasonal calendar, you realize that it only lasts for 5 days. And these 5 days are the only 5 days where you can hear this bird singing and this sort of cloud and this other animal, prancing about. And it's ephemeral.
Okay.
And so because it's ephemeral, you realize how precious it is and how interesting it is. And so I've actually learned to really enjoy those hot and humid days because it comes and it goes. And so it's like, what are the things that I can do now, only now? What are the things that I can eat only now?
I see.
And it makes it incredibly fun. And because there are, 300 or 500, so approximately 400 varietals of rice grown in Japan right now, there's so many varietals to introduce. And I realized that each varietal is very unique and different. And so by focusing on blends that match, that sync up to the microseasonal calendar, I can showcase that variation. So for example, in midsummer, I would recommend varietals that are a little bit lighter and more al dente, toothsome. In midwinter, maybe more chewy and bouncy and rich. Because what you eat as a pairing to rice and what you find enjoyable that time of year really depends on the season.
I see. So using that as kind of perhaps it's accurate to say like kind of the core of what you do, or maybe as a focus point for what you do then. So you provide these blends which you yourself have sourced. Like you go and visit the people who are farming the rice all around Japan to determine the best blend, or to find new connections, or maybe to find perhaps even new varietals from time to time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many varietals that it's difficult for me to keep up as well. But at the end of the day, I think it's the farmer's story. I've realized that people are not necessarily interested in things, but people are really interested in people. And so if I can highlight these farmers and share their story, then it makes the rice taste that much better.
Oh, that's cool. That's really, really cool.
And their personal energy is so within the DNA of the rice itself that when you know this person is loving and energetic and wonderful, then those vibrations get transformed into the rice that they produce.
That's cool. And that makes me think too then of another thing that another service that you provide and that I was lucky enough to participate in one time. You also do kind of many different types of food related experiences, one of which the one that I participated in was a workshop where you taught about, of course, rice, the specific type of rice for the season, and also the proper way to make it. And you had some food pairings prepared, and it was an amazing experience. It sounds like such perhaps a simple thing to, how to cook rice, but the way that you prepared it and all of the steps that I never considered and how it changed the result, I was really, really surprised. It was such a great experience. So you're doing that kind of thing, and you're also sharing the countryside essentially with people who are maybe visiting Japan and have an interest in food and have an interest in going to see these places and like meeting the farmers as well, right?
Yes. So the workshops, absolutely. I often teach people how to cook cook brown rice perfectly every time.
Okay.
And in Japan, most people use rice cookers, but I also like to showcase that cooking it in a donabe or a Japanese clay pot or even a Dutch oven is just as easy and definitely more delicious.
I see.
And so to remind people how easy and delicious it really is, it's hugely kind of interesting for me. And then I also do tours within Tokyo, particularly around the concept of plant-based cookery, and then retreats into the Japanese countryside to connect with farmers and other food purveyors, also artisans like ceramicists, natural dye weaving, that sort of thing. So I suppose it's one of those things where in other countries it may be easy to research this sort of information online and then connect with them directly, but I understand that in Japan sometimes there's language and cultural barriers.
Right.
So whatever I can do to connect people deeper with Japan, with the real Japan, and not kind of like the idealized Japan, or that's if I can be used as a tool in that way, that's really makes me happy.
Right, that's a key point, I think, because a city like Tokyo, or I suppose even Kyoto or Osaka, where there are lots of people from many different countries coming over, the accessibility of information is much higher than it is in these very countryside locations. But that's not to say that those places aren't worth visiting, and there's a wealth of things to explore and discover out there. So that's really, really fantastic. And then I guess this leads to then the one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, which was your book that you created and launched last year, Plant-Based Tokyo. Could you maybe share a little bit about what that book is?
Yes. So a lovely Japanese publishing company came to me and said that they were interested in doing a vegan or vegetarian guide to Tokyo, and I said, fantastic, I can certainly help with that. But I wasn't interested in doing a guide. I just felt like, as you say, you can research this sort of thing online. And frankly, restaurants open and close all the time. And so there has to be some added value into making it a print publication, into a book. And I realized that people were getting very superficial information about plant-based cookery in general, particularly in Japan, where kind of young people tend to be at the whim of, let's say, fashion and apparel companies that are putting out quote-unquote organic food, or this and that is healthy, and there's a lot of fodder out there. But I really wanted to connect people with things that are real and authentic and homemade. And what was important to me were the people behind the food. So just as I was talking about the farmers and the farmers who grow the rice, the same thing goes for the chefs who are making our food. What is their thought process? What are the emotions behind what they're doing? Right. What purveyors do they work with? Right. They usually make their own seasonings, whether it's miso or otherwise. And so I selected my favorite cooks who really do everything themselves, who don't necessarily work for a big company, but run the house themselves and cook all of the food and that sort of thing, and sharing their tale. So if their restaurant no longer exists 10 years from now, the book is there so that you're interested enough in that person to kind of inquire and figure out what they're doing now, right?
Interesting.
That was really important to me.
And that came across. I remember when I picked it up to read it, and it was very easy reading. Like it doesn't read like a guidebook at all, as you mentioned. It reads like a series of profiles more than anything, accompanied by gorgeous photos too. Right. Everything has just these beautiful photos. Such a nice job. But everything in the book is it's like takes a much more philosophical look at what's going on in each of those kitchens. And I was taking notes as I was reading, like the places that I wanted to go to, like places that I had never heard of, many of them. I guess just because, as you said, the information that I'm getting is from, popular food sites like Tabelog, for example. So where maybe many of these places aren't listed, or
they're hidden,
right? So I was really, really pleased and really excited to look through the book and to find lots of places that I didn't even know, and really great resources, and also things to think about as well. Because I felt like you'd done a really good job of weaving into the profiles the importance of having those connections, like to producers, to having a local farmer that you always get your resources from, or there were always like these stories that were showing how the restaurant or the chef was not working as a single independent unit, but how they were connected to the rest of the community, and that sense went through the whole book. And I thought it was really, really nice. It was really great. It was a really great thing. It was such a good resource too. And one of my favorite things about that book is that you also prepared the map that people can access. You have to buy the book to get the to get the password to access the online map. But I thought that was such a good resource for anyone visiting the city who's maybe not so comfortable like putting in addresses, or they don't have the confidence to do that. But you created a map of all the places that you listed in that book so that people can go and just check it, and they'll see like the little pins for where the restaurants are, so they can choose some place that's close to them. Like, I just thought that was such a great idea. And I mean, it would be so helpful if I'm like a first-time visitor and like I'm not confident in the city, but I can at least see which restaurant is closest to me. Like, I really liked the way that it was organized as a resource.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it was a resource in many different ways. So I loved it. Yeah, I'd totally recommend that for anybody who's who's interested in that kind of food.
Yeah.
For Tokyo.
When you look at an address when you're traveling internationally, it doesn't really make any sense. So if it pops up in a like an app and a map, then you can just go to the place that's nearest to you.
Right? Exactly. So I felt like that was an extra little thing. Not even a little thing. That was an extra thing that I felt was like, oh, that's such a great idea. That's so helpful. That's so helpful.
I'm glad.
Yeah. So you have all of these different projects going on, and you have all of these kind of I guess I should say supplementary resources that you're making as well too. So we haven't talked about it yet, but in addition to the rice blend subscription service that you offer, you also have, as kind of a background to this, you share short YouTube videos explaining in depth the micro seasons, so that people can understand. Again, kind of the background information. What is the feeling that you're supposed to, or that you can experience through eating this, or what's the reason for this kind of poetic name on the rice, and so on. So you're creating a lot of supplementary material as well to help people understand more, and all of it is in English. I should say this too.
Absolutely. So I was getting a lot of queries around what exactly is the Japanese traditional micro-seasonal calendar, and I realized that there were chefs and brewers and interesting people outside of Japan who were kind of leaning on the concept of the Japanese micro-seasonal calendar.
Okay.
But as I fleshed through perspective information out there in English, I realized that there really was not much. There wasn't much at all. And so I wanted to provide more information. I mean, frankly, for a lot of people, it would be the first time to even, be acquainted with the concept.
Right.
But there was really nothing sufficient out there that I could copy and paste to someone to say, okay, look, this is really what the micro-seasonal calendar is about, and if you look at this, or if you watch this, or if you read this, then you'll understand a little bit further. And so then I just went ahead and created these short YouTube videos that explain each of the sub-seasons into the micro-seasons, and then really have it used as a reference to the other work that I'm doing. Because my goal really is to connect the Japanese countryside with the world, but through the city. The city, I feel, is a cross section of so many different things. There's so many people coming in and out of the city, in particularly Tokyo, people around the globe really gathering in the city, and also the city in any country, I think, is a really great hub for culture. That's where all the museums are, and that's where that's where fashion is created, and you know, that sort of thing. These are the types of things that you are not able to get in the countryside.
Right.
So I always like to say there's such fantastic things about the countryside, and there are also such fantastic things about the city, and there are things that we can learn from one another.
Right.
And so when you go into the countryside, there's so many learnings there, but I think they're enhanced by what we can learn from the city people who use those things. So for example, with the chefs who were introduced in Plant-Based Tokyo, they're very connected to the people in the countryside, right? Getting fresh produce from the farmers and that sort of thing. But it's very interesting to see what they do with their hands in the city to transform those ingredients into really beautiful art, edible art here. And I think that those people are able to do that because they come from all different backgrounds. Like, you know, a lot of them used to do other things, like, you know, maybe a graphic designer, or maybe an interior decorator, or maybe, you know, someone who was skilled in languages, or maybe a former cabin attendant, or, you know, people come from so many different backgrounds. And that's what makes the story within the countryside more vibrant, because it kind of gets chewed up and then curated through the lens of people in the city.
I see. So there's this kind of transformation of this thing that it originated in the countryside, and not just the thing itself, but also the processes that create this thing that it becomes once it arrives in the city too. So that seems like there's a lot of layers to this discussion. It sounds like that's very cool, like to consider then too. And going back, you said too, then your goal is kind of to share the Japanese countryside, because it, as you said, the city is obviously perhaps much more accessible in terms of information for people, but your goal being to share the Japanese countryside with people outside of Japan, that is. Could you maybe share a little bit about what kinds of topics you're hoping to share more about that's like specific to the countryside? I mean, rice, of course, being one of them.
Rice, of course, yes. So I'm honing really into this concept in Japanese called ishokuju, which means clothing, food, and home. The three fundamental pillars of living, as they say in Japan. And as a easy reference, I call it dress, dine, and dwell.
Okay.
But it's said that without clothing, food, or home, you aren't able to do anything else. And those are kind of the necessities of life, so to speak. And when you go into the Japanese countryside and you take a peek inside people's lives who may live kind of a slower life, they are incorporating these kind of fundamental basics in a very rich way. Like, it's very much part of everyday life. So, you know, for example, all of these things used to be either agriculturally produced or available organically in nature. Everything we ate, everything we wore, and everything we made our homes with, they were all farmed or in the mountainside, so to speak. And now we're using a lot of synthetic things. So in our food, there might be pesticides. In our clothing, there might be synthetic fibers, as well as, you know, in our home. So, you know, the people who are in the countryside are a little bit closer to the natural, non-synthetic materials, I would say. And that's the tangible stuff, but also there's something to be said for the intangible as well, like the way people think. For example, there's a lot of our grandmother's teachings within Dress Dine Well, like making sure that we make handmade miso every single year for the entire year.
Wow. That
ensures that we have really delicious ingredients, preserved ingredients in our kitchen at all times, but also that those ingredients have important microbes that maintain our health, for example. And by buying off-the-shelf miso, we have to be very careful because sometimes it looks like miso and it tastes like miso, but it's not necessarily fermented properly.
I see.
And so you're not getting the full benefits of that. So it's kind of like, what we get from get from the people who are living in the countryside is a little bit of a peek and education into these three pillars that we might be one step away from,
like kind of removed from
it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We might be able to get a little bit closer, and then how do we get closer to that while still living in the city? And that's always my kind of stance, is like, what can us city people do?
Right.
Like, we can learn from the people in the country, but if we're not living in the country, well, what can we do?
That's interesting. There are two directions that I want to go with this. One is, are you kind of imagining then that you would like to help, or maybe help is the wrong word, maybe encourage people in the city to make some like lifestyle changes? Is that kind of one of the goals that you have in your mind then?
I think so. I mean, lifestyle changes for sure. It's more like options. So it's like, if people want to incorporate for example, miso making into their annual to-dos, it's something very easy that city people can do. And at first it might seem overwhelming or just something that's not very familiar, but in practicing and doing so, you realize how easy it is, and then that's something that can be done year after year. And so I guess incorporating some of the hints from our friends in the countryside really kind of help to uplift and nurture our lifestyle in the city.
Okay. So then the other goal, or the other topic that I wanted to bring up then with regard to this is, would you say then that kind of goal, is it different depending on the country that you're targeting? And to be more specific here, would you say that your approach to working towards that goal is different in Japan than it is in, say, like the UK or in the US? Would you say that you're taking kind of different approaches to how to address these issues?
Yes, absolutely. In the US and the UK, when I wax lyrical about rice farming and our grandmother's kitchens and the MicroSeasonal Calendar, it's very much in relation to environmental responsibility and cultural preservation. I think these are keywords that loads of people are interested in, and it hits home and it hits the heart. Environmental responsibility, I think, is something that is incredibly top of mind when you're outside of Japan. Part of everyday language, part of everyday discussion. And cultural preservation, for example, in the U.S. is something so interesting because the U.S. is such a hodgepodge, a melting pot of so many different cultures that kind of hearing about someone's background is that much more interesting, because then you're able to compare it to your own or compare it to your friend who is, something totally different and that sort of thing. And there are so many similarities, but also differences. And where do those similarities and differences lie? And when I have these conversations in Europe, for example, people are extremely proud of their culture and preserving their culture. And so they say, us and, Japanese people, we're the same. We love culture or whatever. We have very deep culture kind of thing. And in Europe, environmental responsibility, yes, is very top of mind, and smart and responsible agriculture. Whereas in Japan, I think that sometimes these conversations are considered too hard-hitting, too close to politics. And so people say, maybe we'll talk about that another time, or not here, not now type of thing.
So it seems kind of like a more divisive issue. There's just the topic of environmental responsibility, or even just like kind of changing mindsets a little bit about, our approaches to food everyday lifestyle choices.
Yes.
So that's seen as divisive in Japan.
Yes, divisive and also aggressive, I think.
Okay. That's really interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So rather than talking about it from a negative perspective, it's really important to talk about it from from a softer, positive perspective. Like, for example, the use of pesticides in Japan is outrageous, but it's something that's already happened. So rather than talking about how outrageous that is, really shifting that conversation to be like, hey, what can we do now? We all love rice. Rice is so important to our everyday, life. That what can we do so that we can, continue to eat this delicious rice, so to speak.
So you have to take different approaches depending on the group of people that you're discussing with then. So taking these very positive agreement-based steps forward. So finding these small commonalities, these points with which people can agree when you're having the topic or when you're having the discussion in Japan, as opposed to when you're having the discussion in Europe or in the USA or Canada or something, where you're able to kind of punch a little bit. You're able to say things that might be perceived to be hard hitting. Here in Tokyo. So is that a challenge for you? That would be challenging for me to keep that in mind, to have to kind of be two people. You're trying to have the same conversation, but in two very different ways to meet the needs of your audience. Then, is that challenging for you to try to do that?
It is challenging, but I suppose that since I was a little girl, I've been used to being two people. Okay. So it's kind of like the English-speaking me is one person, and then the Japanese-speaking me is a totally different person. So it's something that I would say that it's not that I'm not used to it. It's more, I think, difficult when other people look at me. So because I have kind of two faces, so to speak, people can be confused as to what my stance is, or what sort of conversation they can have with me, or you know what I mean, that sort of thing. I think it's just more difficult for other people to dissect what that means.
Oh, that's so interesting. Like usually at about this time in the interview, we're talking about kind of these very external factors, like when speaking with expats about their experience working in Japan, they'll share about the challenges of working with Japanese people. But what you're describing now is kind of this very internal challenge of being perceived differently according to like the language that you're speaking, or according to the people with whom you're working at the time. So,
right. So for example, on my website, and also, in Plant-Based Tokyo, the book, it's very important for me not to have direct translation, because I feel like the English-speaking audience knows and wants different things from the Japanese-speaking audience. So the language that I use or the information I provide is actually different.
Okay. I noticed that actually when I was reading, because I neglected to mention that earlier. It's a bilingual book. The book is in English and in Japanese. It's accessible for both audiences. So that's very interesting, because I remember reading through the book and thinking to myself, like, oh, that's interesting. Like, in this caption, it says this in Japanese, but it doesn't mention that in English. So that's why. Okay. Interesting. Because
I think there's a certain level of like background information or curiosity that's different for both sets. And also for those people who can read both, like in my case too, it would be boring if it was the exact same thing I thought. Okay. And so, changing it up just a little bit. And yeah, so I guess when I'm talking about like how the outside world perceives me, like for example, everything you put out in social media, for example, everyone says it's not all real. It's not, it's just, a portion of what you put out there. And that's exactly the case. It's kind of like I put that stuff out there, but the approach I take when I am writing captions in Japanese is different from the approach I take when I'm putting captions in English. And then for people who can read both, how are they perceiving me, and how can I be authentically me, but be both of those things?
Yeah,
kind of
that's an extra challenge, I think. Yeah, it's especially when you're talking about the people who can read both. If there's a discrepancy between the two, they might they might even, have that is this authentic question even deeper? Like, wait, is this, this person seems totally different in this language. Like, can I trust this person? That sort of thing. Yeah, but it's actually like a cultural sensitivity issue for sure.
There are idiosyncratic things that I try to be really cognizant about. And maybe to a fault that it's confusing. So these are the types of things I think I need to continue working on, is like one set of information as opposed to tailoring it for two sets.
I was going to say, I feel like that's very interesting, because that's kind of, I suppose, the opposite of the approach that I take when I prepare English and Japanese content. I match it, but I've noticed I have simplified my English as well. I've kind of reduced my message to the core message. Also, like, with respect to the fact that many people who are in my audience are non-native English speakers too. Like, so that the approach that I've taken is a bit different, but I think I just simplified it and tried to reduce it to the main points that I want to say, and make sure that I'm able to communicate that as clearly as possible. So I completely, I respect your approach as well, though, too.
I don't know.
Like,
it hasn't
that's a challenge.
Me very far, so I feel like maybe, simplifying it to one voice. It's because I have two voices, right? And then that's confusing for people.
Yeah.
So I think that maybe simplifying to one voice that somehow unifies those two worlds that I, straddle would be better. I just have to figure out what language I put that in.
I think that's an ongoing challenge. I feel like there's never a moment where you go, I've got it. Because there's always going to be that moment. At least for me, there's always that moment where I think, I like the way that this is written in Japanese, or I like the way that this is written in English. I wish I could make the same feeling happen in the other language.
Right.
Sometimes it just doesn't work. Anyway, I want to shift topics a little bit then. So we've kind of been talking about your work, your present work, and the work that's brought you to where you are today, as well as kind of your thoughts about working across cultures and languages. I want to shift topics then to kind of what's coming up for you, or what the next thing is that you're really excited about doing. The next kind of step, or the next kind of place that you see your projects going. Is there something that you're really excited about for the coming year?
Yes. So 2020, I've decided, is a year of education for myself, of learning from my peers, learning from my quote-unquote teachers. These teachers are people who are professionals and top, at the top of their game across various genres. I'm thinking everything from like an artist to a DJ to a doctor to a, cultural anthropologist. I think there's so many people who are able to teach me things, and in getting educated, I thought maybe I should just turn the video on and then share that information with the rest of the world, because there are loads of Japanese people who are doing really interesting work, but are kind of trapped in Japanese language. And so if what I can do, well, I get the benefit of learning from them, but then if I can also then kind of pay it forward by unlocking it from Japanese, that information from Japanese language.
Oh, so you're saying recording interviews with these various teacher figures and sharing them in English?
Yes.
Oh.
So the interviews will be in Japanese, and then it'll be subtitled in English.
Oh, wow, that's huge.
So that hopefully people in the future will say, oh, I've been wanting to connect with, well, I've been asked this too, but I've been wanting to connect with Japanese creatives, who are doing whatever specific type of work. Do you know anyone? But, if they're able to find those people through the video series that I'm working on, then that's even better,
Okay. And so with the series, kind of focus on the types of people that you mentioned before, like those people, for example, working in the countryside, who have these, who are doing farm or agriculture or maybe craft-related work. Is it going to focus kind of on those groups of people? Or you also mentioned, like DJs and, and so on. So it sounds like you have kind of a wide variety of people.
Yes, I think it'll run the gamut from people who are evidently obviously very connected to Japan, what we can learn from the earth, that sort of thing. And then that triad of living, those 3 pillars of living, clothing, food, and home, or dress, dine, and dwell. Because I think that there's a lot of things that we can learn from that concept. As well as those who on the surface may not seem to be connected with those pillars or the fundamentals of Japanese living. But what I have this theory, and the theory is that those Japanese people who really are at the top of their game, no matter what industry they're in, they're so intellectually curious and connected to their sense of like home and place, that they've done loads of research. For example, a DJ may have done a lot of deep digging about what sound means, or Japanese instruments, or the playlists from our grandmothers, that sort of thing. And so I think it's in part being incredibly educated and deep diving into the genre that where they work. And then that deep diving is just naturally connected to these 3 pillars of Japanese living.
I see.
Through my interviews, I want to, see whether this theory is correct or not. Yeah.
Just perhaps a side question. Do you think that tendency to, as you say, dig deep, do you think that that's something that's uniquely Japanese?
I don't think it's necessarily uniquely Japanese, but I think Japanese people are very good students.
We could unpack that statement. Very good students. Now, the way in which people go about being students or learning might not necessarily be the most effective, or but I think the Japanese innate want to be a student, to be continually learning, is very, very interesting. That's a very interesting theory. I look forward to watching that. Please make it. We are near the end of our time together, so I will now ask you, for everyone watching and listening, where can we find you online to learn more about your work?
I am at thericegirl.com. And on the website, that will connect to my YouTube page and my Facebook page and my Instagram page. So thericegirl.com is what you need to know.
Great. Yes. And I follow you on Instagram, Facebook, everywhere. So I will continue to keep up with your projects. We'll wrap it up here, I think, unless there's anything burning that you'd like to add. All right. Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Yay.
Thanks so much for watching this episode of Non-Native Creative. If you liked this episode, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Feel free to leave comments about this episode in the comments section too. Please make sure to stop by the project Patreon at patreon.com/nonnativeCreative. Patrons can get access to Patreon-only discussions, bonus behind-the-scenes media, interview transcripts, and access to patron-only live streams. Your support will help make sure the series can continue to share exciting, interesting stories from creative people working across borders. Thanks again for watching. See you next week.